The knot was perfect. Clara had practiced it for 3 weeks on discarded hemp in the quarters after midnight, her swollen belly pressing against her thighs as she crouched in darkness. The same knot Silas Godfrey used on the whipping post, the same knot that left scars like ladder rungs on her husband's back before they buried him in unmarked clay. Now that rope hung from the nursery beam, coiled through a brass ring Silas himself had installed to hold the mosquito netting. He entered the room believing a child was coming early. Instead, he found Clara standing beneath that beam, her face empty of everything except the mathematics of revenge. By dawn, the story would be suicide. But 3 people knew the truth, and one of them was still growing inside Clara's womb, a passenger to its mother's reckoning. The Godfrey Plantation sat on 4,000 acres of Mississippi Delta clay, 8 miles southwest of Natchez, where the river bent like a question mark. In the autumn of 1862, cotton still ruled despite the war grinding away in Virginia and Tennessee. Silas Godfrey owned 73 people by the county ledger. He preferred to say he employed them, but the chains in the tobacco barn and the scars on 47 backs told a different arithmetic. Clara had been born on the property in 1838, which made her 24 that October. She was what Silas called house quality. Light brown skin, straight posture, capable of serving dinner without trembling when white guests made comments about breeding stock. She had married Samuel 3 years earlier in a ceremony that held no legal weight, but meant everything to the people who stood witness in the yard between the kitchen house and the quarters. Samuel worked the forge. Strong shoulders, careful hands, a mind for angles and heat. He could repair a broken plow blade or shoe a nervous horse with equal patience. Silas valued him at $800 in the plantation ledger, right between a prize mare and a good wagon. That valuation would matter less than anyone expected when Samuel's body was carried past the main house on a November afternoon, wrapped in canvas that could not quite contain the blood. The Godfrey house was brick, painted white every spring by hands that would never own anything white or brick. 12 rooms, tall windows, a porch that wrapped 3 sides like arms holding the structure in place. Silas was 41 that year, a widower since 1858 when yellow fever took his wife Margaret. No children survived her. Some said God had judged him. Others said Margaret had simply refused to carry his seed to term after learning what he did in the quarters after dark. Clara worked inside. Mornings she helped the cook, a woman named Josephine who had fed 3 generations of Godfreys and never once been thanked. Afternoons, Clara served whatever meal Silas wanted, brought him correspondence, refilled his whiskey when the glass showed bottom. She moved through the house like water finding channels, present but unnoticed until needed. It was a skill she had learned young. Invisibility was a kind of armor. By October, her pregnancy was 6 months along and impossible to hide. The baby pressed against her spine when she stood too long, made her ankles swell, forced her to pause on the stairs between first and second floor. Silas had noticed in August. He found it amusing. The dinner party on October 9th was small by Godfrey standards. Only 6 guests. Judge Horace Pemberton and his wife Eleanor. Marcus Finch, who owned the neighboring plantation. Reverend John Halloway from the Methodist Church in Natchez. A banker named Thomas Caldwell up from New Orleans. And Dr. Edwin Morris, who attended most of the county's white families and some of their property when it was valuable enough. Clara served the oyster course, then the roasted duck, then the sweet potatoes candied in molasses that made the silver tarnish faster. She moved between kitchen and dining room 7 times, her belly preceding her like a declaration. The guests tried not to stare. Some succeeded better than others. It was during the third course that Silas decided to make sport of it. He was 3 glasses deep in French wine that cost more than Samuel earned in a year of forge work, though Samuel earned nothing because you cannot earn what you do not own, not even the sweat of your labor. "Clara," Silas said, his voice loud enough to silence the other conversations. "Tell Judge Pemberton when you are due." She stopped mid-pour, the wine bottle hovering over Mrs. Pemberton's glass. "March, sir. The doctor says March." "March," Silas repeated, smiling at his guests. "Another one for the spring planting. Perfect timing, wouldn't you say? Even their babies are bred for my profit." Silence like a held breath. Then Marcus Finch laughed, because men like Marcus Finch always laughed at men like Silas Godfrey when they were sitting at Silas Godfrey's table eating Silas Godfrey's food. The others joined in, a scattered chorus of discomfort disguised as mirth. Only Dr. Morris looked away, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Clara finished pouring. She returned to the kitchen where Josephine stood at the stove, her back rigid. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing to say that would not make it worse. But Clara's hands shook as she arranged dessert plates, and Josephine noticed. Everyone always noticed the shaking. That night, Clara lay beside Samuel in their cabin, a 12 by 14 structure of rough pine with gaps in the walls wide enough to see stars through. Samuel's arm was around her shoulders. The baby kicked against her ribs, a prisoner testing its cell. "He will sell this child," Clara said quietly. "Before it draws breath, he will have found a buyer." Samuel's arm tightened. "We could run. Plenty are running now with the war. They say the Union is freeing people in Tennessee. Tennessee is 200 miles. I cannot walk 200 miles. Then after the baby comes." Clara turned to look at him in the darkness. "You know what happens to runners who get caught. You have seen the dogs work." Samuel said nothing, because they both knew she was right. What Clara did not know was that Samuel had already been caught. Not running, but something almost as dangerous. Talking. He had been overheard 3 days earlier by the overseer, a man named Virgil Cade, who reported directly to Silas and enjoyed his work with an enthusiasm that troubled even other white men. Samuel had been standing by the forge, speaking to another enslaved man about the war news that filtered down from Natchez, about what might happen if the Union won, about what freedom could mean. Just talking. But talking was enough. November 7th, 1862. The day started with frost thick enough to crunch under boots. Clara woke before dawn to help Josephine prepare breakfast. Biscuits and gravy, fried ham, coffee strong enough to strip rust. Silas ate alone at the long table, reading a Memphis newspaper that was 3 weeks old, but still carried more news than anything else in the county. Samuel should have been at the forge by sunrise. He was not there at 6. He was not there at 7. At 8, Virgil Cade came looking for him, accompanied by 2 other men Clara did not recognize. They found Samuel in the quarters, still sleeping because he had worked late the previous night, repairing a wagon axle, and had been told he could start his day an hour later than usual. Virgil did not care about permissions or late nights. He cared about the overheard conversation from 3 days earlier and the fact that Silas Godfrey had given him authority to maintain discipline however he saw necessary. What followed happened in the yard between the main house and the quarters, visible to anyone who looked out a window or stepped outside for any reason. 39 lashes. The same number Judas took in payment for betrayal, though Virgil was not a man who thought in biblical terms. He simply knew that 39 was one short of the number that might kill a man outright, and Silas preferred his property functional, if not quite whole. But Samuel was not young. He was 32, and his body had already been broken twice before. Once when he was 15 and tried to run. Once when he was 26 and fought back against a white man who had put hands on his sister. The 39 lashes opened old scars and created new ones. His back became a map of pain drawn in blood. And somewhere around the 28th strike, something inside him tore in a way that could not be stitched or prayed over. He died at 3 p.m. Dr. Morris was not called. Property did not require a physician when it stopped working. It simply required disposal and a note in the ledger. Clara was in the nursery when Josephine found her, preparing the room for a white child who would never be born there because Silas's wife was dead and he had no intention of remarrying. She was folding linens that smelled of lavender and wood smoke when Josephine appeared in the doorway, her face carrying news that did not require words. Clara walked to the quarters. Samuel's body lay on a plank table in the cabin they had shared, covered with a sheet that was already soaking through with red. His face was still, almost peaceful, as if he had simply decided to rest and would wake any moment asking about supper. She did not cry. Not then. She stood beside the table and placed one hand on his chest, feeling for a heartbeat she knew would not come. The baby inside her kicked once, hard enough to make her gasp. Then silence. By evening, Silas had deducted $800 from his property inventory. He made the entry himself in the leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his study. Samuel's name, the date, the word deceased, and in the narrow margin, a single notation in Silas's careful script, disciplinary action, approved. The burial happened after dark. No ceremony, no words except what the people whispered among themselves as they lowered Samuel into earth that would grow cotton the following spring. Clara stood at the edge of the grave, her belly pressing against the black dress Josephine had found for her. She watched the dirt fall, and something inside her made a decision that had not been available before Samuel's blood soaked into Mississippi clay. She would be patient. She would be invisible again. And she would wait until the moment when invisibility became a weapon instead of armor. The morning after Samuel's burial, Clara appeared at the main house before sunrise. She knocked on the kitchen door where Josephine was already kneading dough, her hands working the rhythm of decades. Josephine looked up, surprised. Clara was not due to work for 2 more days. Grief had purchased her that much reprieve, and Silas was not a man who wasted labor, but he understood that broken property needed time to become functional again. "I want to work," Clara said quietly. "I need to work." Josephine studied her face, reading something in the flatness of Clara's expression that made her pause mid-need. "You should rest. The baby will come whether I rest or work. I would rather work." So Clara returned to the house. She served breakfast. She brought Silas his morning coffee and newspaper. She moved through the rooms with the same water-like efficiency as before, except now there was something else beneath the surface, a current running in the opposite direction of her visible compliance. Silas noticed the change but misread it entirely. He saw broken resistance, saw a woman who had learned her place through the loss of her husband, saw confirmation that discipline, however harsh, ultimately served its purpose in maintaining order. He mentioned as much to Judge Pemberton during a lunch visit 3 days later. "The one I showed you at dinner," Silas said, gesturing toward Clara as she cleared plates from the table. "Her husband died last week. Disciplinary matter, unavoidable. I worried she might become sullen or worse. But look at her now. docile as a lamb. Sometimes tragedy teaches lessons that kindness cannot. Clara kept her eyes down, her hands steady on the china. She gave no indication that she had heard or understood, but she had done both. That afternoon, she made her first alliance. Josephine was the cook, but she was also the keeper of the house's chemical geography. She knew where Silas stored his medicines, his cleaning supplies, his poisons. Every plantation kept arsenic for rats. The storage shed behind the kitchen house held a wooden crate containing 6 glass bottles, each wrapped in brown paper and labeled in a pharmacist's careful hand. Josephine was the only one with a key to that shed. Clara found her there at dusk, checking inventory for the household supplies. The older woman looked up, and for a moment neither spoke. The air between them held 30 years of shared survival, separate griefs, and the kind of understanding that did not require explanation. "I need to know what is where," Clara said finally. "In case I need to help, in case you are sick or away." Josephine's hand paused on a sack of cornmeal. She was 56, old enough to have seen this pattern before, old enough to know that sometimes the questions people asked were covers for the questions they could not voice aloud. "The arsenic is in the corner," Josephine said slowly. "Behind the flour sacks. Silas keeps count. He checks the level once a month, writes it in a book. If anything goes missing, he will notice. Unless someone replenishes it from another source. Unless that." Clara nodded. "Thank you." "I did not tell you anything," Josephine said, turning back to her inventory. "I was just taking stock, and you happened to be here. I was never here." But Clara was there, and she would be there again, measuring, memorizing, calculating the distance between intention and execution. The stable hand was named Daniel, 22 years old, quick-minded, born on the property just like Clara. He had a gift for animals and for knowing which paths through the woods would hide a man's passage from dogs or patrols. Samuel had trusted him. That was enough for Clara. She found Daniel 3 days after her conversation with Josephine, in the barn where he was brushing down Silas's favorite mare. The smell of hay and horse sweat filled the space, mixing with the November cold that seeped through the plank walls. "I need to know the roads," Clara said without preamble. "Where they go, where they are watched, where they are not." Daniel's hand paused on the horse's flank. He did not look at her directly, but his voice was careful. "You planning to run?" "I am planning to survive. Running might be part of that. You are 6 months gone. 7 soon. You cannot run far. I know what I can and cannot do. I am asking what you know about the geography." Daniel resumed brushing, the motion steady and deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "The main road to Natchez has checkpoints now. Patrols every 3 miles, more at night. The river road north is watched because of Union sympathizers trying to reach Memphis. West toward Louisiana is open sometimes, but the swamps will kill you faster than dogs. And east? East is forest for 20 miles, then Vicksburg. But Vicksburg is Confederate, under siege by Grant's army. You would be running toward a battle." Clara absorbed this, her hand resting on her belly where the baby was moving, a swimmer testing the walls of its tank. If someone needed to move at night without being seen, which path would you tell them? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he pointed with the brush toward the barn's eastern wall. "There is a creek bed 1/2 mile that way, runs northeast through Pemberton land, then cuts back toward the river. Dry this time of year. A person could walk it without leaving tracks, at least for 5 or 6 miles. After that, you are in hardwood forest. No roads, no patrols, also no food, no shelter, no help. But no patrols. No patrols. Clara nodded slowly. If someone needed supplies hidden along that route, water, food, blankets, could it be done? Daniel set down the brush and finally looked at her directly. It could be done. It would take time. 2 weeks, maybe 3, to cache things without anyone noticing. And it would cost favors I do not have to spare. What if I could help you earn those favors? How? I work in the house. I hear things. Silas talks when he drinks, which is most evenings. He talks about property values, about who owes him money, about which neighbors are struggling. Information is worth something to the people who need it. Daniel considered this. You are building something more than running. I am building options. Running might be one. There might be others. The horse shifted its weight, making the stall boards creak. Outside, evening was settling over the plantation like a held breath. Daniel picked up the brush again, but his voice was different now. Committed. I will start tomorrow. Cash points every mile for 6 miles. Small things. Things that will not be missed from the smokehouse or the stores. But Clara, yes? Whatever you are planning, be sure. Because once you start down a path like this, there is no walking backward. Only forward or dead. I know. And she did. There was a boy in the quarters named Thomas. 12 years old, small for his age, with eyes that missed nothing. His mother had been sold south 3 years earlier, and his father had died of fever the winter before. He survived by making himself useful, running errands, carrying messages, fetching tools when needed. What most people did not know was that Thomas could read. His mother had taught him in secret, using a Bible she had stolen from the main house and hidden beneath the floorboards of their cabin. She would wake him before dawn, teach him letters by candlelight, make him memorize passages so he could recite them even if the book was discovered. When she was sold, Thomas kept the Bible, and he kept reading. By 1862, he could read anything put in front of him. Newspapers left lying around, documents carelessly placed, and most usefully, the ledger Silas kept in his study. Clara discovered this by accident. She was cleaning the study one afternoon in late November when she noticed Thomas standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the open ledger on Silas's desk. He was staring at it with the intensity of someone translating a code. You can read that, Clara said quietly. Not a question. Thomas flinched, caught, then nodded slowly. What does it say? The boy hesitated. Then, reading upside down from across the room, he recited, November 7th, Samuel Blacksmith, value $800, deceased, disciplinary action, approved. Clara's hands tightened on the dust cloth she was holding. What else? There are other names. People sold, people bought, amounts, dates. He paused. There is also a separate book, smaller. He keeps it locked in the desk drawer. But sometimes he leaves it out when he is drinking. I have seen it twice. What is in the smaller book? Debts. People who owe him money. People he owes money to. The amounts are large. Thousands of dollars. Clara set down the cloth and moved to the desk, standing beside Thomas. The ledger was open to the current month. She could make out some words, names, numbers, but not enough to piece together meaning. Thomas could read the story that Silas had written about their lives, the accounting of human beings rendered as inventory. If I needed to know who Silas owes money to, Clara said slowly, could you tell me? If I saw the small book again? Yes. And if I needed to know when he expects payments, or who is demanding payment from him. Also, yes. Clara looked at the boy. He was trembling slightly, aware of the danger in this conversation, but also aware of something else. An opportunity to be useful in a way that mattered. To use his stolen literacy as a weapon instead of just a secret. Can you keep watching? Clara asked. Can you tell me what you learn? Why? Because information is a kind of power, and right now we need power more than we need anything else. Thomas thought about this, then nodded. I will watch. Be careful. If Silas discovers you can read, I know what will happen. My mother told me before she was sold. Reading is a hanging offense for us. Not just hanging, worse. The boy's face was solemn. I know. But if I cannot use what she taught me, what was the purpose of the risk she took? Clara had no answer for that. So she simply placed one hand on Thomas's shoulder, a brief acknowledgement of shared danger, and then sent him back to the quarters before anyone noticed how long he had been in the study. That night, Clara lay in the cabin that now felt cavernous without Samuel's presence. The baby was quiet for once, as if sensing its mother's thoughts required silence. She was building something. 3 pillars. Josephine with access to poison. Daniel with knowledge of escape routes. Thomas with the ability to read the systems that govern their lives. 3 people who could help her do what needed to be done. She did not yet know what that would be, but she was learning. Patience was a kind of planning, and planning was a kind of hope, however dark. Christmas came to the Godfrey plantation with the usual theatrical Christianity that men like Silas deployed once a year. A larger meal for the enslaved population. A half-day of rest on Christmas Eve. A reading from Scripture delivered by Silas himself, standing on the main house porch like a prophet addressing his flock. The performance was meant to demonstrate benevolence. What it actually demonstrated was the distance between the porch and the yard, between those who spoke and those who listened without choice. Clara was 7 months pregnant by then. The baby had dropped lower in her pelvis, pressing against her bladder, making every step an exercise in discomfort. She stood in the back of the assembled crowd, one hand supporting her lower back, listening to Silas read from Luke about the birth in Bethlehem. The irony was not lost on anyone present. After the reading came the announcement. Silas folded his Bible and looked out over the 73 people he owned, his expression magnanimous in the way of men who confused ownership with kindness. This has been a difficult year, he began. The war continues. Prices are uncertain, but we have persevered together, and God willing, we will continue to prosper. Pause for effect. The crowd said nothing, because the crowd never said anything during these performances except when prompted. I have made certain financial arrangements to ensure this plantation's future, Silas continued. Some of you will be aware of changes in the coming months. These changes are necessary and, I believe, ultimately beneficial to all of us. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Changes meant sales. Sales meant families torn apart, children sent south. Women and men disappeared into the cotton belt, where death was just slower starvation. In particular, Silas said, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Clara, I have made arrangements regarding certain upcoming births. There are buyers who specialize in young property, and I have negotiated favorable terms for delivery in the spring. This is good business, and good business sustains us all. The crowd remained silent, but the silence had texture now. Wait. Clara understood before anyone needed to explain. Silas had sold her child. had found a buyer willing to pay in advance for an infant not yet born, would take the baby within days or weeks of its birth and send it wherever such transactions sent human children when they were sold before drawing breath. Her hands moved to her belly, an instinctive gesture of protection that meant nothing against the legal apparatus of slavery. The baby kicked, as if sensing its mother's fear. That night, Clara met with Josephine, Daniel, and Thomas in the storage shed behind the kitchen house. It was the first time all four of them had been in the same space, and the risk was enormous. But the risk of inaction had become larger. "He is selling the baby," Clara said without preamble. "Before it is born, he has already sold it." Josephine's face was grim. "I heard. He told Dr. Morris over dinner last week. Said he had a buyer in Mobile willing to pay $200 for a healthy infant. The doctor said nothing." "What could he say?" Daniel's voice was bitter. "He is complicit like everyone else. The judge, the reverend, the banker. They all sit at Silas's table and eat his food and say nothing about the buying and selling of children. What would you do if you were the doctor? Speak up and lose your welcome in every plantation house in the county?" The question hung in the air. What would you do? Clara had been asking herself that question for 7 months, and the answer kept changing. At first, she thought she would do nothing. Then she thought she would run. Now she was considering something else entirely. Something that required more patience than running and more courage than submission. "I need to know 3 things," Clara said, looking at each of them in turn. "Josephine, I need to know if arsenic can be replaced without Silas noticing. Daniel, I need to know if a body could be moved from the house to somewhere else without being seen. Thomas, I need to know what leverage exists, who Silas owes, how much, and how desperate he is." Josephine spoke first. "The arsenic can be managed. There is a pharmacy in Natchez that sells it. If someone went there and purchased a bottle, and if that bottle happened to appear in the storage shed while an equal amount disappeared, Silas would never know. But someone would need money for the purchase." "I have money." Clara had been stealing small amounts from Silas's pockets for months. Quarters and half-dollars that added up slowly. $5 in total, hidden beneath the floorboard of her cabin. "Will $5 be enough?" "More than enough." Clara turned to Daniel. "The body question?" Daniel looked uncomfortable. "A body could be moved. Not far, but far enough. The creek bed I told you about runs within 200 yards of the house. If it happened at night, in darkness, 2 people could carry a man-sized weight that far without being seen. But Clara, I know what I am asking. Do you? Because moving a body means there is a body to move, which means someone has died, or will die. I know." Thomas, who had been silent until now, spoke up. His voice was steady despite his 12 years. "Silas owes $8,000 to the bank, in Natchez. Thomas Caldwell is pressing for payment. There are letters in the small book. Caldwell is threatening to call the loan if payment is not made by February 1st. Silas does not have $8,000. He has been selling property to raise funds. Your baby is part of that. He needs the $200 from Mobile to make a partial payment and buy more time." Clara absorbed this. What happens if Silas dies before February? The debt would pass to his estate. If he has no heirs, the property would be sold at auction to satisfy creditors. That includes the land, the equipment, and all 73 of us. So his death changes nothing for us. Not immediately, but in chaos there are opportunities. Auctions take time. Estates require settlement. Between his death and the final accounting, there would be weeks. maybe months. Time enough for people to disappear if they had a plan and resources. Clara nodded slowly. The pieces were assembling themselves. Not a full picture yet, but the outline of one. A plan that required precision, patience, and a willingness to cross the last line that separated thought from action. "I need more time," she said. "The baby is due in March. That gives us 2 months. Keep watching, keep preparing. When the moment comes, I will know it, and we will act." The others nodded, a silent compact sealed in the darkness of a storage shed that smelled of flour and leather and the faint metallic tang of rat poison. They dispersed separately, waiting 5 minutes between exits so no one would notice them leaving together. Clara was the last to go, standing alone in the darkness for a moment, her hands on her belly where new life was growing toward a world that had already decided its value before it drew breath. Not if Clara had anything to say about it. Dr. Edwin Morris made his monthly visit to the Godfrey Plantation on January 15, 1863. He came in his black carriage pulled by a gray mare that knew the route by heart. Morris was 53, trained in Philadelphia before the war, too old now to be conscripted, but young enough to feel the weight of his own complicity every time he examined enslaved bodies that bore the marks of violence he never reported. He examined Clara in the nursery, while Silas waited downstairs in the study. The baby's heartbeat was strong. Clara's blood pressure was elevated, but not dangerously so. Her ankles were swollen, which was common in late pregnancy. Everything was progressing normally toward a birth that would end in theft. "You should rest more," Morris said, repacking his instruments. "The final weeks are taxing. Your body needs time to prepare." Clara said nothing. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded over her belly, her face expressionless. Morris hesitated. Then, in a lower voice, "I heard about your husband. I am sorry for your loss." "Are you?" The question caught him off guard. "I beg your pardon? Are you sorry, Dr. Morris, or are you simply saying the words that are expected?" Morris flushed. "I cannot change what happened. You could have said something when Silas told you about selling this baby. You could have objected. You are a physician. You take an oath to do no harm. Does that oath not apply to children sold before they are born?" The doctor's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Clara, do not call me Mrs. I am not married in the eyes of any law you recognize. I am property. My child is property. And you sit at the same table as the man who owns us and say nothing because your comfort is worth more than our lives." Morris stood abruptly, his bag clutched in both hands. "I cannot change the world. I am one man. You are one man who could speak. Instead, you are silent. That is a choice, doctor. Own it." She watched him leave, his shoulders rigid with guilt and anger and the peculiar frustration of men who know they are wrong but cannot admit it without dismantling the systems that sustain them. He would do nothing. She had known that before speaking, but she wanted him to know that his silence was visible, that the people he examined could see exactly what he was. After Morris left, Silas came upstairs. He was in a good mood, whistling some tune Clara did not recognize. The doctor had given him a favorable report. The merchandise was healthy. The buyer and mobile would be pleased. "Dr. Morris says you are progressing well," Silas said, standing in the doorway. "He recommends rest. I am inclined to agree. Starting tomorrow, I want you to spend most of your day here in the nursery. Prepare the room. Make it ready. The baby will be here soon, and we want everything to be perfect for its brief stay." Clara kept her face neutral. "Yes, sir." The buyer will arrive within a week of the birth. He has arranged transport, paid in advance. $200, Clara. That is a good price. You should be pleased that your child will start life with such value. Yes, sir. Silas studied her for a moment, as if trying to read something beneath her compliance. Then he smiled, satisfied that he had broken whatever resistance might have existed. You have become very practical since Samuel's death. I appreciate that. Practicality is a virtue in this world. Yes, sir. He left. Clara remained sitting on the bed, her hands on her belly, feeling the baby move. The room around her was fully prepared now. White curtains, a wooden cradle that Silas had commissioned from a carpenter in Natchez, clean linens, everything arranged for a birth that would happen here and a child that would leave within days. Except Clara had other plans. She had been studying the room for 2 weeks, measuring distances, testing windows, noting the location of the ceiling beam where mosquito netting hung during summer months. The beam was exposed, thick oak running the width of the room, strong enough to support weight, strong enough for what she had in mind. That night, she practiced the knot again. The same knot Silas used on the whipping post. She had memorized it by watching, by standing in the yard on days when discipline was administered, and forcing herself to observe the mechanics of cruelty. Now she could tie it in darkness, her fingers moving with the precision of a woman who had run through this motion 100 times in her mind. The rope was already in place, coiled and hidden behind the crates of linens in the corner. She had stolen it from the tobacco barn in November, replacing it with a similar length so the theft would not be noticed. Now it waited, a coiled promise. Patience was almost over. Planning was almost complete. The moment was approaching when invisibility would become action, when the current running beneath her compliance would surface and sweep everything away. She lay in her cabin that night, alone, listening to the sounds of the quarters settling into sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, Josephine was checking her stores. Daniel was memorizing paths. Thomas was reading by stolen candlelight. They were a conspiracy of 4, bound by shared danger and shared purpose. And in Mobile, a buyer was counting his money, preparing to collect merchandise he had paid for in advance. Merchandise that would never arrive. Because Clara had made a different choice about what her child's first lesson would be. Not submission. Survival. Thomas found the small book on January 23rd. Silas had left it on his desk after an evening of heavy drinking, the kind of drinking that started with bourbon at dinner and ended with whiskey at midnight. Thomas had been sent to the study to collect glasses and found the book lying open, its pages covered in cramped handwriting that detailed amounts and dates and consequences. He read quickly, committing key details to memory. Then he found Clara in the kitchen house the next morning and recited what he had learned. $8,000 to Thomas Caldwell. Due February 1st. Silas has made partial payments. $400 in December, $300 in January. He needs $1,500 more to satisfy Caldwell until spring. He is planning another sale. Clara's hands paused in their work of peeling potatoes. Who? The list includes 6 names, all young, all healthy, all valued above $500. He has not decided which ones yet, but he has buyers identified in 3 cities. Are you on the list? Thomas nodded. 4th name. Clara set down the knife. Her belly was enormous now, the baby due within 6 weeks. She moved carefully, every step measured, every motion calibrated to the weight she carried. We move before he makes that sale, before he chooses. When? Soon, I will know when. Be ready. Thomas left through the back door, disappearing into the morning light. Clara resumed peeling potatoes, her hands steady despite the rage building behind her ribs like a second pregnancy. Silas was going to sell more of them, was going to break more families, was going to turn human beings into currency to satisfy his debts and maintain his house, and keep his wine cellar stocked with French bottles. Not if she stopped him first. February 10th brought weather that felt like the end of the world. Dark clouds rolled in from the west at noon, turning the sky the color of old bruises. By 3, rain was falling in sheets, hammering the roof of the main house and flooding the yard between buildings. Lightning split the darkness every few minutes, followed by thunder that rattled windows and made the enslaved population huddle in their cabins, convinced that God himself was announcing judgment. Clara's water broke at 5 in the evening. She was in the nursery, folding linens that did not need folding, when she felt the first contraction. A tightening across her belly that made her breath catch, then warmth spreading down her thighs. She looked down to see fluid pooling on the wooden floor, clear and slick. The baby was coming early, 4 weeks early. She sent word to Josephine, who sent word to Silas, who sent word to Dr. Morris. But Morris was in Natchez, treating a merchant's wife, and the roads were already flooding. He would not make it to the plantation before morning at the earliest. Silas paced in his study, frustrated by the inconvenience. The buyer in Mobile expected a full-term healthy infant. An early birth complicated things. Clara labored through the night alone except for Josephine, who stayed with her in the nursery, boiling water and gathering towels and speaking in low, soothing tones that helped Clara focus through the pain. The contractions came in waves, building and cresting, and leaving her gasping in the spaces between. "You are doing well," Josephine said, wiping Clara's face with a cool cloth. "The baby is small because it is early. That will make the birth easier." Clara gripped the bedpost, riding another contraction. When it passed, she looked at Josephine with clear eyes despite the pain. "Is everything ready?" Josephine understood immediately. "Yes. Daniel has the route prepared. Thomas knows what to do. The arsenic is replaced and measured. Everything is ready." "Good." "Clara," Josephine's voice was careful. "Are you certain? There is no going back once you start." "I have been certain since November 7th. This is just the moment arriving." Another contraction. Stronger this time. Clara breathed through it, her hands white-knuckled on the bedpost. Outside, the storm was reaching its peak. Lightning flashed, illuminating the nursery in stark white light. Thunder followed immediately, so close it felt like the house itself was shaking. Perfect conditions. Sound to cover sound. Darkness to cover movement. A storm to cover everything. The baby was born at 2:37 in the morning on February 11th, 1863. A girl. Small, as Josephine had predicted, but healthy. She drew breath and cried, her voice thin but insistent, announcing her arrival to a world that had already assigned her a price. Clara held her daughter for the first time, feeling the weight of 7 pounds and a lifetime of stolen possibilities. The baby's face was wrinkled and red, her eyes squeezed shut, her hands curled into fists no larger than walnuts. Perfect. Impossible. Precious. "She needs a name," Josephine said softly. "Mercy. That is a dangerous name in this place. It is the only name I have left to give." Clara cleaned her daughter with the tenderness of someone handling glass, wrapped her in a blanket that smelled of lavender, let her nurse until the baby fell into exhausted sleep. Then Clara stood, ignoring the protests of her body, and began preparing for what came next. "Send for Silas," she said to Josephine. "Tell him the baby has arrived, but there is something wrong, something he needs to see immediately." Josephine hesitated. "Clara, trust me, please." Josephine nodded and slipped from the room, moving through the dark house to wake Silas from his whiskey-soaked sleep. Clara remained in the nursery, holding Mercy, memorizing her daughter's face in the dim lamplight. She had perhaps 20 minutes before Silas arrived. 20 minutes to be a mother before she became something else. She used every second. Silas Godfrey arrived at the nursery at 3:15 in the morning, wearing a dressing gown and carrying a lamp that cast wild shadows on the walls. His face was flushed with sleep and alcohol, his expression somewhere between irritation and concern. Behind him, Josephine stood in the doorway, her face carefully neutral. "What is wrong with it?" Silas demanded, crossing to the cradle where Mercy lay sleeping. "Is it damaged? Deformed?" Clara was standing by the window, one hand resting on the sill. She had spent the last 20 minutes arranging the room exactly as she needed it. The rocking chair positioned beneath the ceiling beam, the windows locked from the outside, the keys hidden, the rope coiled and ready behind the crates in the corner. Everything prepared. "Nothing is wrong with her," Clara said quietly. "She is perfect." Silas frowned. "Then why did you summon me in the middle of the night?" "Because I wanted you to see what you are selling." Silas's expression hardened. "I do not need lectures from property about business decisions. The buyer in Mobile will not be receiving anything. Not this child. Not ever." The temperature in the room changed. Silas set down his lamp and turned to face Clara fully, his irritation shifting to something more alert, more dangerous. "You forget yourself," he said carefully. "You forget what you are and what that child is. You have no say in what happens to it or to you. That is the natural order of things." "Natural," Clara repeated. The word tasted like ash. "You murdered my husband and called it discipline. You sold my child before she drew breath and called it business. You built your wealth on broken families and called it natural order. Tell me, Silas, what part of any of that is natural?" Silas took a step toward her. "You are upset. The birth has made you emotional. I will overlook this insolence if you return to your senses immediately." Clara did not move from the window. "Do you remember what you said at dinner in October? That even our babies are bred for your profit?" "I remember." "Do you remember laughing when you wrote Samuel's death in your ledger? $800 deducted. Disciplinary action approved." He was disobedient. Discipline was necessary. He was talking. That was his crime. Talking about freedom. Which is precisely why discipline was necessary. Silas's voice had gone cold now, the veneer of paternalism stripped away. "Order requires consequences. You people need to understand that there are limits, lines that cannot be crossed." "You are right," Clara said. "There are lines, and you crossed them." She moved then, faster than a woman who had given birth 3 hours earlier should have been able to move. She crossed the room, grabbed the rope from behind the crates, and before Silas could react, she had looped it around the rocking chair and was pulling it tight around the brass ring on the ceiling beam. Silas lunged for her, but Clara had spent weeks calculating this moment. She sidestepped, letting his momentum carry him past her, then drove her shoulder into his back, sending him stumbling into the chair. It tipped. He fell. For a moment, He was off balance, disoriented, trying to understand what was happening. Clara used that moment. She looped the rope around his throat, pulled it tight, and secured it to the chair leg with the same knot he had used on the whipping post. The knot Samuel's back had memorized. The knot that left scars like ladder rungs. Silas thrashed, his hands clawing at the rope, his face turning red. But Clara had positioned everything precisely. The chair was heavy enough to anchor him. The rope was short enough to restrict movement. And her seeming weakness over the past months had been a lie. Grief had not broken her. It had refined her into something harder than Silas had ever imagined. She held the rope, watching his face change colors, red to purple to something darker. His eyes bulged, his mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. She counted his heartbeats by the pulse visible in his temple. Watched them slow. Watched them stop. It took 4 minutes. Samuel had lasted longer under the lash. Clara supposed that was a kind of mercy, though she felt nothing resembling mercy in that moment. Only the satisfaction of a debt paid in the currency it was owed. When Silas stopped moving, Clara checked for breath. Found none. She left the rope in place, arranged his body in the chair, and opened the window that had been locked from the outside. Made it look like he had hanged himself. Like grief or guilt or financial pressure had finally broken him and he had chosen this way out. Then she turned to Josephine, who had watched everything from the doorway, without moving or speaking. "Get Daniel," Clara said. "We need to move quickly now." Josephine nodded and disappeared into the storm. By sunrise, the story was in place. Silas Godfrey had hanged himself in the nursery during a storm, overcome by financial pressures and the isolation of widowhood. The enslaved population reported finding him at dawn when the household began to wake. Dr. Morris was summoned from Natchez, examined the body, and wrote "suicide by hanging" in his report without asking questions he did not want answered. Judge Pemberton came to oversee the estate. He found the ledgers in Silas's study, including the small book that detailed $8,000 in debts and a list of people Silas had planned to sell. The judge was pragmatic. Estates required settlement. Debts required satisfaction. The plantation would be sold at auction, the proceeds used to pay creditors, and any remaining value distributed according to Mississippi law. That process would take weeks, maybe months. During those weeks, people began to disappear. Daniel left first, using the creek bed route he had prepared. He took 3 others with him, following the cache points northeast toward Union lines that were slowly advancing through Tennessee. They vanished into the February darkness and were never seen in Natchez again. Thomas left next, carrying papers Josephine had forged that identified him as a free boy traveling to relatives in Memphis. He rode north in a wagon driven by a sympathetic merchant who owed Josephine a favor. The merchant asked no questions. Others followed, 1 or 2 at a time, using the chaos of estate settlement to slip away. Some were caught, some made it. The calculus of escape was always uncertain, but uncertainty was better than the certain misery of being sold to satisfy a dead man's debts. Clara stayed. She had Mercy to care for, and traveling with a newborn in February was suicide. But she also stayed because she wanted to see the estate dissolved, wanted to watch as Silas's property was cataloged and auctioned and scattered, wanted to witness the destruction of everything he had built on the backs of stolen labor. The auction happened on March 27, 1863. 63 people were sold that day. Families separated. Children sent south. Women and men purchased by strangers and loaded into wagons heading toward plantations in Alabama and Louisiana and Arkansas. Clara watched it all from the window of the quarters, holding mercy, memorizing faces so she could carry their names forward, even if their bodies went elsewhere. But Clara herself was not sold. Something in the records had identified her as problematic. A woman whose husband had died under discipline. A woman who had given birth to a child the buyer in Mobile no longer wanted because it was premature. A woman whose eyes held something the auctioneers could not quite define, but which made them uncomfortable. She was purchased for $90 by a farmer from Vicksburg who needed kitchen help. The price was low because he sensed the same thing the auctioneers had sensed, that Clara was dangerous in ways that exceeded her small frame and her 7-week-old daughter. He was right to sense it. But by the time he understood the danger, Clara and Mercy were already gone, vanished during the confusion of the Vicksburg siege in May. They slipped through Union lines, claimed contraband status, and disappeared into the chaos of war. What happened to them after that? No records say for certain. But there are stories. Dr. Edwin Morris lived another 23 years after Silas Godfrey's death. He continued his practice in Natchez, treating plantation families and examining enslaved bodies when called upon. But something changed in him after that February night. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He began drinking heavily, whiskey that started at dinner and continued until he fell asleep in his study. In 1879, 16 years after the war ended, Morris wrote a letter to his nephew in Philadelphia. The nephew was studying medicine, preparing to take the same oath Morris had taken decades earlier. The letter was found among Morris's papers after his death, never sent. "There are truths we carry that are too heavy to speak," Morris wrote. "Silences we maintain that corrode the soul. I was present for atrocities I never reported. I examined bodies bearing evidence of violence I never documented. I sat at tables with men who bought and sold human beings, and I said nothing because my comfort was worth more than their lives." In February of 1863, a man died on a plantation outside Natchez. The official cause was suicide, but I saw the rope marks on his throat, saw the arrangement of the furniture, saw the expression on the faces of the people who reported finding him. I knew what had happened, and I wrote suicide in my report, because the alternative would have required me to acknowledge my own complicity in creating the conditions that made murder the only available justice. The letter continues for 3 pages, a catalog of Morris's failures dressed up as confession. It ends with a question. What does it mean to take an oath to do no harm when the entire system you work within is built on harm? Can a man be moral while serving an immoral order? Or is morality itself a luxury available only to those who can afford consequences? Morris never sent the letter, never spoke publicly about what he knew. He died in 1886, his reputation intact, his conscience in ruins. Judge Horace Pemberton also lived to see emancipation. He watched the Confederacy collapse, watched Mississippi rejoin the Union, watched freed people become citizens, at least in legal theory, if not in practice. He spent his final years trying to reconstruct the social order that had enriched him, using new laws to accomplish what old ones had done more explicitly. In 1871, Pemberton presided over a case involving a freedwoman accused of theft. The evidence was thin. A white farmer's claim that the woman had stolen food from his smokehouse. The woman insisted she had purchased the food from a merchant in town. No receipts existed. It was her word against his. Pemberton ruled in favor of the farmer, sentenced the woman to 3 years' labor on his farm as restitution. The ruling was legal under Mississippi's convict leasing system. a new form of bondage dressed up as criminal justice. The woman's name was not recorded in the court documents, but several freed people who attended the trial remembered. They remembered that the judge who sent her back to forced labor was the same judge who had sat at Silas Godfrey's table, making jokes about breeding stock. They remembered that the systems might change names, but the cruelty remained consistent. And they told their children, who told their children, who kept the stories alive even when official history tried to bury them. Reverend John Halloway preached until his death in 1892. He never mentioned Silas Godfrey from the pulpit, never acknowledged the dinners he had attended or the conversations he had participated in. His sermons focused on forgiveness and divine mercy and the importance of accepting one's station in life with Christian patience. But in private, late at night, Halloway suffered from nightmares. He would wake screaming, describing flames and judgment, and a voice asking him why he had remained silent when silence was itself a sin. His wife would comfort him, assume the dreams were about the war or aging or spiritual crisis. She never knew they were about a woman with a swollen belly and a murdered husband and a righteousness that exceeded anything Halloway had ever found in Scripture. These were the witnesses, the men who saw or knew or suspected what had happened and chose comfort over truth. They lived full lives, died respected, were buried with honor. History recorded their names in careful script, celebrated their contributions, and forgot their silences. What would you do? If you were Dr. Morris examining a body you knew was not suicide? If you were Judge Pemberton watching human beings sold on your courthouse steps? If you were Reverend Halloway blessing a system you knew was evil? The answer matters less than the question, because most people do nothing. That is how systems of horror sustain themselves, not through active cruelty alone, but through the accumulated inaction of comfortable witnesses who choose not to see what seeing would cost them. Clara disappeared into the chaos of war and was never documented again in any official capacity. No census records, no land titles, no death certificate. She became one of the millions of freed people who slipped between the cracks of history, their stories preserved only in oral tradition and the memories of those who knew them. But there are fragments, letters that mention a woman named Clara who worked as a laundress for Union troops outside Vicksburg. A teacher's journal from a freedmen's school in Memphis that describes a woman with an infant daughter who could read and who helped other freed people navigate contracts and legal documents. A passing reference in a newspaper article from 1876 about a boarding house in Chicago run by a woman whose past no one quite knew. Were these the same Clara? Impossible to know with certainty. But the fragments add up to a story that feels true, even if it cannot be proven. A woman who survived by becoming invisible again, who raised her daughter in freedom, however fragile that freedom was, who taught mercy to read and to remember and to understand that justice sometimes required breaking every law that claimed to define it. Mercy herself appears more concretely in the historical record. In 1884, a woman named Mercy Freeman published a short memoir about growing up during the war. The book was printed by a small press in Boston and sold perhaps 200 copies before disappearing from circulation. Most libraries that owned it eventually discarded it during space purges. But one copy survived, discovered in a church basement in Brooklyn in 1947. The memoir describes Mercy's earliest memory, being held by her mother during a storm, listening to wind and rain and thunder, while her mother sang softly about deliverance and judgment and the righteousness of the oppressed. My mother told me later that I was born the night she chose freedom, Mercy wrote. She said that every person faces a moment when they must decide whether to accept the world as it is or break it and rebuild something better. She chose breaking. And I, newborn and helpless, was the witness to her choice. The memoir never names Silas Godfrey, never describes the plantation or the specific violence that preceded Mercy's birth. But it speaks in clear terms about the systems that required violence to function, and the women who dismantled those systems one deliberate act at a time. Justice, Mercy wrote, is not always legal. Legality is simply the codification of power by those who hold it. When the law itself is unjust, when the courts serve cruelty and the churches bless bondage, then justice must find other channels. My mother understood this. She became the justice that the legal system refused to provide. The memoir ends with a description of her mother's hands. Small and scarred and capable of extraordinary tenderness and extraordinary violence. She held me with those hands, fed me, bathed me, taught me to read. And with those same hands, she reshaped the world into something that allowed me to exist as a free person rather than property. I owe her everything. We all owe her everything. Mercy Freeman died in 1926 at the age of 63. She had 4 children, all of whom survived to adulthood. Her grandchildren scattered across the northern states, carrying forward a legacy they understood only partially. Some knew the story of their great-grandmother who had been enslaved in Mississippi. Fewer knew about the night in February when she had chosen violence over submission. The details faded with each generation, smoothed into legend. But legends have their own truth. In Natchez, even now, there are people who tell stories about the Godfrey Plantation, about the owner who hanged himself in a nursery during a storm, about the enslaved woman who disappeared that same night with her newborn daughter, about justice that arrived in darkness and left by morning, unseen but felt. The stories disagree on details. Some say Clara poisoned Silas before hanging him. Others say she had help from a conspiracy of enslaved people. Some claim Silas was already dying from drink and debt, and Clara simply accelerated his end. Others insist the suicide was genuine and Clara's disappearance was unrelated coincidence. But everyone agrees on the core. A woman took power over her own life and her child's life when every system said she had no power at all. She calculated revenge with the same precision that accountants calculate profit. And she executed that revenge with surgical accuracy, then vanished into freedom before anyone could stop her. That is the story that persists, not the official record of suicide and estate settlement, not the doctor's report, or the judge's ruling, or the reverend's silence. The story that matters is the one kept alive in church basements and family gatherings, and the quiet conversations between people who understand that history is written by those who survive, not those who rule. On still nights in Mississippi, some say you can hear a woman singing in the old cemetery, where Samuel was buried without marker or ceremony. The song is about deliverance and the righteous judgment that comes to those who build fortunes on broken families. No one knows who sings it. No one can quite locate the source. But the melody carries across the clay and through the cotton fields that still grow where the Godfrey Plantation once stood, a reminder that some debts are paid in currencies that ledgers never record. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.